Hello and welcome to a history lesson today. We are going to look at the history of romance. Let's describe what is meant by romance. Romance is a pleasurable emotional feeling of love for another person, and as well refers to a collection of courtship behaviors undertaken to express the emotions created by the feeling. The feeling of romantic love is associated with sexual attraction, but romantic feelings can exist without expectation of physical consummation and be subsequently expressed. And historically, the term romance originates with the medieval idea of chivalry as set out in chivalric romance literatures. Let's look at the historical usage. Historians believe the word romance to have developed in the French vernacular, meaning verse narrative. The word was originally an adverb of the Latin origin Romanicus, meaning of the Roman style. The connecting notion is that European medieval vernacular tales were usually about chivalric adventure, not combining the idea of love until late into the 17th century. The word romance has also developed with other meanings in other languages, such as the early 19th century Spanish and Italian definitions of adventurous and passionate, sometimes combining the idea of love affair or idealistic quality. In primitive societies, tension existed between marriage and the erotic, but this was mostly expressed in taboo regarding the menstrual cycle and birth. Anthropologists such as Claude Lévi-Strauss show that there were complex forms of courtship in ancient as well as contemporary primitive societies. There may not be evidence, however, that members of such societies formed loving relationships distinct from their established customs in a way that would parallel modern romance. Before 18th century, many marriages were not arranged, but rather developed out of more or less spontaneous relationships. After 18th century, illicit relationships took on a more independent role. In bourgeois marriage, illicit may have become more formidable and likely to cause tension. In Ladies of the Leisure class, Rutgers University professor Bonnie G. Smith depicts courtship and marriage rituals that may be viewed as oppressive to modern people. She writes, when the young women of the Nord married, they did so without illusions of love and romance. They acted within a framework of concern for the reproduction of bloodlines according to financial, professional, and sometimes political interest. Subsequent sexual revolution has lessened the conflict arising out of liberalism, but not eliminated them. Anthony Giddens, in his book The Transformations of Intimacy, Sexuality, Love, and Eroticism in Modern Society, states that romantic love introduced the idea of narrative into an individual's life. He adds that telling a story was one of the meanings of romance. According to Giddens, the rise of romantic love more or less coincides with the emergence of the novel. It was then that romantic love associated with freedom, and therefore the idea of romantic love created the ties between freedom and self-realization. David R. Shumway, in his book Romance, Intimacy, and the Marriage Crisis, states that the discourse of intimacy emerged in the last third of the 20th century, and that this disclosure claimed to be able to explain how marriage and other relationships work. For the discourse of intimacy, emotional closeness was much more important than passion. This does not mean by any means that intimacy is to replace romance. On the contrary, intimacy and romance coexist. In the 21st century has seen the growth of globalization, and people now live in a world of transformations that affect almost every aspect of our lives, and love has not been the exception. One example of changes experienced in relationship was explored by Giddens regarding homosexual relations. According to Giddens, some homosexuals were not able to marry. They were forced to pioneer more open and negotiated relationships. These kind of relationships then permeated the heterosexual population. Shumway also states that together with the growth of capitalism, the older social relations dissolved into marriage. Marriage meaning for women changed as they had more socially acceptable alternatives and were less willing to accept unhappy relations, and therefore divorce rates substantially increased. The discourse of romance continues to exist today together with intimacy. Shumway states that on one hand, romance is the part that offers adventure and intense emotions while offering the possibility to find the perfect mate. On the other hand, intimacy offers deep communication, friendship, and long-lasting sharing. And let's look into the popularization of love. The concept of romantic love was popularized in Western culture by the concept of courtly love, chivalries, or knights in the Middle Ages engaged in that were usually non-physical and non-marital relationships with women of nobility whom they served. These relations were highly elaborate and ritualized in a complexity that was steeped into a framework of tradition which stemmed from the theories of etiquette derived out of chivalry as a moral code of conduct. Courtly love and notions of domine were often the subjects of troubadours and could be typically found in artistic endeavors such as lyrical narratives and poetic prose of the time. Since marriage was commonly nothing more than a formal arrangement, courtly love sometimes permitted expressions of emotional closeness that may have been lacking from the union between husband and wife. In terms of courtly love, lovers did not necessarily refer to those engaging in sexual acts, but rather the act of caring and to emotional intimacy. The bond between a knight and his lady, or the woman of typically high stature of whom he served, may have escalated psychologically, but seldom ever physically. For knighthood during the Middle Ages, the intrinsic importance of a code of conduct was enlarged as a a value system of rule codified as a guide to aid a knight in his capacity as champion of the downtrodden, but especially in his service to the Lord. In the context of dutiful service to a woman of high social standing, ethics designated as a code were effectively established as an institution to provide firm moral foundation by which to combat the idea that unfit attentions and affections were ever to be tolerated as a sacred game of tryst behind closed door. Therefore, a knight trained in substance of chivalry was instructed with especial emphasis to serve a lady most honorably with purity of heart and mind. To that end, he committed himself to the welfare of both lord and the lady with unwavering discipline and devotion, while at the same time presuming to uphold core principles set forth in the code by the religion by which he followed. Religious meditations upon the Virgin Mary were partially responsible for the development of chivalry as an ethic and lifestyle. The concept of honor of a lady and knightly devotion to her, coupled with an obligatory respect for all women, fractured prominently as central and to the very identity of medieval knighthood. As knights were increasingly emulated, eventual changes were reflected in the inner workings of feudal society. Members of the aristocracy were schooled in the principles of chivalry, which facilitated important changes in the attitude regarding the value of woman. Behaviorally, a knight was to regard himself towards a lady with transcendence of premeditated thoughts, his virtue ingrained with his character. A chevalier was to conduct himself always gracefully, graciously bestowing upon her the utmost courtesy and attentiveness. He was to echo shades of this to all women, regardless of class, age, or status. Over time, the concept of chivalry and the notion of the country gentleman became synonymous with the ideal of how love and romance should exist between the sexes. Through the timeless popularization of art and literature, of tales of knights and princesses, kings and queens, and the formative and long-standing subconsciousness helped to shape relationship between men and women. The amour, or the art of courtly love, as it is known in English, was written in the 12th century. The text is widely misread as permissive of extramarital affairs. However, it is useful to differentiate the physical from without. Romantic love as separate apart from courtly love, when interpreting such topics as marriage is no real excuse for not loving. He who is not jealous cannot love. No one can be bound by a double love, and when made public, love rarely endures. Some people believe that romantic love evolves independently in multiple cultures. For example, in an article presented by Henry Grunbaum, he argues therapists mistakenly believe that romantic love is a phenomenon unique to Western cultures and first expressed by troubadours of the Middle Ages. The more current and Western traditional terminology meaning court as lover, The general idea of romantic love is believed to have originated in the late 19th century or the early 20th centuries, primarily from the French culture. This idea has spurred the connection between the word romantic and lover, thus coining English phrases for romantic love, such as loving like the Romans do. The precise origins of such connections are unknown, however, although the word romance or equivalents thereof may not have the same connotations in other cultures. The general idea of romantic love appears to have crossed cultures and been accepted as a concept at one point in time or another. Now let's look more into courtly love. Courtly love was a medieval European literary conception of love that emphasized nobility and chivalry. Medieval literature is filled with examples of knights setting out on adventures and performing various services for ladies because of their courtly love. This kind of love is originally a literary fiction created for entertainment of the nobility, but as time passed, these ideas about love changed and attracted a larger audience. In the High Middle Ages, a game of love developed around these ideas as a set of social practices. Loving nobility was considered to be an enriching and improving practice. Courtly love began in the ducal and princely courts of Aquitaine, Province, Champagne, Ducal Burgundy, and Norman Kingdom of Sicily. At the 11th century, in essence, courtly love was an experience between erotic desire and spiritual attainment, a love at once illicit and morally elevating, passionate and disciplined, humiliating and exalting, human and transcendent. The term courtly love was first popularized by Gaston Paris and was since come under a wide variety of definitions and uses. Its interpretation, origins, and influences continue to be a matter of critical debate. Let's look at the history of it. The practice of courtly love was developed in the castle life of four regions: Aquitaine, Provence, Champagne, and Ducal Burgundy. From around the First Crusade, 1099, Eleanor of Aquitaine brought ideals of courtly love from Aquitaine first to the court of France, then to England, where she was queen to two kings. Her daughter Marie, Countess of Champagne, brought the courtly behavior to the Count of Champagne's court. Courtly love found its expression in the lyrics, poems written by troubadours such as William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, one of the first troubadour poets. Poets adopted the terminology of feudalism, declaring themselves the vassal of the lady and addressing her as Mesdames, my lord, which had the dual benefit of allowing the poets to use a code name so as to avoid having to reveal the lady's name, at the same time as flattering by addressing her as his lord. The troubadour's model of ideal lady was the wife of his employer or lord, a lady of higher status, usually the rich and powerful female head of the castle. When her husband was away on crusade or other businesses, she dominated the trash household and the cultural affairs. Sometimes this was the case even when the husband was at home. A lady was rich and powerful, and the poets gave voice to the aspirations of the courtiers class. Only for those who were noble could engage in courtly love. This new kind of love saw nobility not based on wealth and family history, but on character and action, thus appealing to poorer knights who saw an avenue for advancement. Since the time of marriages among nobility had little to do with modern perspective of what constitutes love, courtly love was also a way for nobles to express the love not found in their marriage. Lovers in the context of courtly love need not refer to sex rather than an act of emotional loving. These lovers had short trysts in secret, which escalated mentally but might not physically. On the other hand, continual references to beds and sleeping in the lover's arm in the medieval sources such as the Troubadour, Albus, and the romances such as Traitine de Troyes and Lancelot imply that at least in some cases a context of actual sexual intercourse. The rules of courtly love were codified by the late 12th century in Andreas Capellanus' highly influential work, the Amori, concerning love. The Amori lists such rules as marriage is no real excuse for not loving. He who is not jealous cannot love. No one can be bound by a double love, and when made public, love rarely endures. Much of its structure and its sentence were deprived of Ovid's Ars Amatoria. Let's look at Andalusian and Islamic influence. Hispano-Arabic literature, as well as Arabic influence on Sicily, provided a further source in parallel with Ovid for the early troubadours of Provence, overlooked, though there's sometimes in an account of courtly love. The Arabic poets and the poetry of Muslim Spain express similarly oxymoronic view of love as both beneficial and distressing as the troubadours were to do, while the broader European contact with Islamic world must also be taken into consideration. Given that practices similar to courtly love were already prevalent in Al-Andalus and elsewhere in the Islamic world, it is very likely that Islamic practices influenced the Christian Europeans. William IX and Duke of Aquitaine, for example, was involved in ongoing reconquista in Spain, so that he could come into contact with Muslim culture a great deal. According to Gustav E. von Grunbaum, there were several relevant elements which developed in Arabic literature, including such contrasts as sickness, medicine, and delight or torment, to characterize the love experience. The notions of love for love's sake and exaltation of the beloved lady have been traced back to Arabic literature of 9th and 10th centuries. The notion of ennobling power of love was developed in the early 11th century by the Persian psychologist and philosopher Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna in Europe. In his treatise Risala fil Ishq, treatise on love. In the final element of courtly love, the concept of love as desire never to be fulfilled was at times implicit in Arabic poetry, but was first developed into a doctrine in European literature in which all four elements of courtly love were present. According to an argument outlined by Maria Rosa Menalcal in the Arabic role in medieval literary history in the 11th century Spain, a group of wandering poets appeared who would go from court to court and sometimes travel to Christian court in southern France. A situation closely mirroring what would happen in southern France about a century later. Contacts between these Spanish poets and French troubadours were frequent. The metrical forms used by Spanish poets were similar to those later used by the troubadours. And we shall look at the analysis aspect of courtly love. The historic analysis of courtly love varies between different schools of historians. That sort of history which views the early Middle Ages dominated by prudish and patriarchal theocracy views of courtly love as a humanist reaction to puritanical views of Catholic Church. In the language of scholars who endorse this view, the courtly love is cherished for its exaltation of femininity as an ennobling spiritual and moral force in contrast to ironclad chauvinism of the first and second estates. The condemnation of courtly love in the beginning of the 13th century by the Church as heretical is seen by these scholars as Church's attempt to put down this sexual rebellion. However, other scholars note that courtly love was certainly tied to Church's effort to civilize the crude Germanic feudal code in the 11th century. It was also suggested that the prevalence of arranged marriages required other outlets of expression of more personal occurrences of romantic love, and thus it was not in reaction to prudery or patriarchy of the Church, but the nuptial custom of the era that courtly love arose. In the Germanic culture world, a special form of courtly love can be found, namely minne. At times, the lady could be a princess lointaine, a faraway princess, and some tales told of men who had fallen in love with women who they had never seen, and merely on hearing their perfection described, but normally she was not so distant. As the etiquette of courtly love became more complicated, the knight might wear the colors of his lady, where blue or black were sometimes the color of faithfulness, and green could be a sign of unfaithfulness. Salvation, previously found in the hand of priesthood, now came from the hands of one's lady. In some cases, there were also women troubadours who expressed the same sentiment for men. Let's look at romance aspect of courtly love. The vernacular poetry of Romans courtiers or courtly romances included many examples of courtly love. Some of them are set in the cycles of poems celebrating King Arthur's court. This was a literature of leisure directed to a largely female audience for the first time in European history. Allegory. Let's look at allegory. Allegory is a common in romantic literature of Middle Ages. It was often used to interpret what was already written. There is a strong connection between religious imagery and human sexual love and medieval writings. In the tradition of medieval allegory began in part with interpretation of the Song of Songs in the Bible. Some medieval writers thought that the book should be taken literally as an erotic text. Others believed that the Song of Songs was metaphor for relations between Christ and the Church, and the book could not even exist without that as its metaphorical meaning. Still, others claimed that the book was written literally about sex, but that this meaning must be superseded by the meanings related to Christ, to the Church, and the individual Christian soul. Marie de France's La Ludique toys with the idea that human romantic love is a symbol of God's love when two people love each other so fully and completely that they love each other for God, separating and moving different religious environments. Furthermore, the main character's first wife leaves her husband and become a nun so that he can marry his new lover. Allegorical treatment of courtly love is also found in Roman de la Rose by Guillaume de Loris and Jean de Neume. In it, a man becomes enamored with an individual rose on a rose bush, attempting to pick it and finally succeeding. The rose represents the female body, but the romance also contains lengthy, digressive discussions on free will versus determinism, as well as an optics and influence of heavenly bodies on human behavior. Lastly, let's look at the stages of courtly love. So there are many stages of courtly love. Let's look at it one by one. First stage of courtly love is attraction to the lady, usually via eyes or glances. The second stage is worship of the lady from afar. And the third stage is declaration of passionate devotion. And next stage is virtuous rejection by the lady. And the fifth one is renewed wooing with oaths of virtue and eternal fealty. And the next stage is moans of approaching death from unsatisfied desire and other physical manifestation of lovesickness. I would say the seventh stage is heroic deeds of valor, which wins the lady's heart. And the eighth is consummation of secret love. And the last stage is endless adventures and subterfuge, avoiding detection. That is the stages of courtly love. So thank you for tuning in to learn the history of romance and courtly love. Stay tuned for more history lessons. Goodbye.